The balance of power in the world is changing and the tides are favouring China. Saudi Arabia must also change the tides, and of course this is a strategic way for them to do so. The first thing I'm going to do in this debate is do two pieces of setup. Firstly, what are Saudi Arabia's interests? There are broadly two things. The first of which is just its economic interest, and secondly on regional stability, which I'll impact later in the speech. The second caveat is to say this policy is basically the status quo, which is to say Saudi Arabia is currently growing closer to China at the moment, and what we are doing is we're simply supporting them making close ties, to have more trade agreements, to negotiate them more, to interact with them more, as opposed, and also we have to take the trade-off at this being exclusive to the US in many instances. So the first argument we're going to then make is, why is this beneficial to Saudi Arabia's economic interests? The first thing here is that China is a particularly good partner for things like resource exchange for two reasons. The first of which is Saudi Arabia is clearly a great producer in things like crude oil, and China likes crude oil because it has a manufacturing industry as compared to the US, which once used to have like a dependency on crude oil, but these are shifting away for three reasons. Firstly, they're shifting away just because they have more of a service economy. Secondly, the fact that they're investing far more into things like renewables because of the political will which exists to have more environmentally friendly policies. And also, thirdly, just because they themselves usually have their own kind of natural resource sources, which is why they're less dependent on Saudi Arabia. The second reason to give here is just to say that China also has a significantly larger growing consumer base, which is that the middle class is becoming increasingly wealthy, which is why they want more goods, they want more things like cars, and Saudi Arabia can directly produce it, which is why they're particularly a good trading partner. Clarification with CEO.
Yeah, look, on either side we're going to trade, we're going to exchange resources, blah, blah, blah. You have to defend substantially reducing ties with the US as a result. Can you explain clearly what that means in terms of what you're going to do? Like, what are you going to cut off?
We can trade more with China, we can just be happy to cop the sanctions from the US, we can obviously also just like, seems relatively fine, happy with that. And so on. So just do it more if it means you trade less because you have a finite amount of resources. That seems relatively clear to me. The second thing to note here is why this is particularly good for things like the Belt and Road Initiative, which is to say, firstly, I think China has particularly good incentives to develop in this area for two reasons. Because firstly, Saudi Arabia is the gateway to the Middle East and a particularly useful place geographically. But also secondly, just that generally speaking, the area is one which they have not gone to yet, which is why they can build more infrastructure. There is also resources extracting the area. You can see that in China's interest in Qatar there. Why is this likely to work out well for Saudi Arabia? Is that for two reasons. The first of which is obviously China does not have necessarily the best incentives for Belt and Road in many countries, but for Saudi Arabia, because nominally speaking, the US is perceived as a competitor, it means China has to offer Saudi Arabia a particularly good deal to ensure they don't get screwed over. The second thing is that China also just has way more leverage. Saudi Arabia has way more leverage in the form of natural resources, which is why they don't get owed. But the third thing, which is particularly useful for economic improvement, is to say Saudi Arabia is currently engaging in its largest project to build smart cities, and it's important for two reasons in Saudi Arabia. The first of which is that this is something which is good for domestic buying because people find it popular, because people see it as a way to improve their lives, but also secondly, for things like international legitimacy, because this is something which is novel, something which is cool, is something which attracts things like foreign direct investments, is something they particularly care about. You see this in the case where they have a red line, which is this line in the desert that they build some cities, and this requires lots of technological work to work, right? For example, to have traffic systems which can time things properly requires a lot of things like data collection, having things like facial recognition technology, so water and resources can be delivered to people based on their need, requires huge amounts of technological investment. And there's a reason why only China can uniquely do this, as opposed to the United States, for two reasons. The first of which is that the US simply has no interest in this area and has not developed technology, as opposed to China, who also simply wants to develop cities in these ways. But secondly, the types of technology which is needed to run these smart cities are often things China has. So for example, the US often doesn't develop things like facial recognition because of the perception that you're going to use things like surveillance. China, on the other hand, develops heaps of technology when it comes to facial recognition because they want to oppress the people and because they want to demonstrate things like societal controls. And you can also see this in the instance that Chinese traffic crossings often have a camera and they post your face on, you can jaywalk and things like that, which is why they clearly do have this technology which Saudi Arabia can also capitalize on, which is why, uniquely speaking, China is better able to help Saudi Arabia in this instance compared to any other instance there. So then the comparison to the US as to why they're no longer a particularly good trade partner or someone who helps these interests is that firstly, the US to an extent has a democratic mandate which cares about things like morality, right? They care that Saudi Arabia does things like oppress women, they care that Saudi Arabia does things like fund terrorist groups or, for example, bomb Yemen, which is to say, when Saudi Arabia imprisoned and killed journalist Jamal Khashoggi, there was huge amounts of backlash, and what resulted in was a set of sanctions which made the US, in nominally speaking, a very unreliable trade partner. Because they have to constantly step through this kind of balance between calling out such bad behaviours, but also still extracting resources from them, that makes them a very inconsistent partner, as opposed to a country like China, who are far more likely to be stable and far more likely to just get trade investment, because China has a policy of non-interference. They don't care about what ideology you have, they don't care about what political system you have, and are agnostic to these issues, which is why they're far more reliable than things like the US. But then,
the Chinese government is loaded with massive amounts of SOE and local government debt, meaning BRI projects are being substantially scaled down. When Saudi murdered a Washington Post journalist, the US gave it a slap on the wrist. Who exactly is more reliable?
Even if they scale things down, clearly there's still benefits in terms of technological transfer and also things like resource extraction. I don't think you deal with the vast majority of this case. And insofar as, yes, it is scaled down to the extent, obviously if it is a particularly good area, an area you haven't gone into compared to things like Central Asia, clearly there is still an incentive to develop there as well. Seems relatively clear. The impact of this economic argument is simple, which is number one, clearly you're able to improve the economy of Saudi Arabia. But secondly, this is particularly important because Saudi Arabia is not a democracy, which means the form of legitimacy they derive from is the people believing the government is able to provide them services and able to improve their lives. Insofar as they're able to improve the economy substantially and also provide them the resources, you're far less likely to get things like riots and protests and people being unhappy, which is why this is unique to Saudi Arabia and why we have to care about it a lot. The second argument I'm going to make is on regional stability. Why does Saudi Arabia care about regional stability? Two things. Firstly, clearly it's kind of bad for the economy, but also secondly, they spend a lot of money having to fund groups who they want to support in this area, etc. So how does China help with regional stability? The first thing is clearly that China cares for the reason that they care about regional stability because they want the BRI to develop, which is why you need stability to be able to build kind of trains, infrastructure and roads between different sorts of countries, so you can't have people have conflicts and can't have people fight. The second thing is that China has a unique ability to broker peace in many instances, as you can see between Saudi Arabia and Iran recently, for two reasons. The first of which is that China is often viewed as a trustworthy source because they're agnostic to ideological leanings and political structures. The second thing is just that they also have a lot of diplomatic weight, which is to say they often, countries like Saudi Arabia, want to enter things like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which is to say they now have a strong mode of enforcing these kind of negotiations and obligations in ways which the US can't do so. And the third thing is that China necessarily hasn't seen to look legitimate because they want to see themselves as a world power who's able to oppose the US. That is why China uniquely helps stabilize the region, which is good for Saudi Arabia's interests. I think on net, this is probably a good decision for Saudi Arabia, and you ought to support this policy.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to open the debate inside opposition, I call upon the leader of up. Here.
Here.
So, OG's case about an ascendant China may have made sense like 7 years ago, right? But what happens now is that we face a world where zero COVID has crippled Chinese domestic demand, has caused brain drain in its tech industry, and where it's rapidly becoming internationally isolated with Russia as a pariah state. We think that Russia is in no shape to support Saudi Arabian ambitions right now. What is our stance? Firstly, Saudi Arabia will continue its current path of seeking out US support and relying more on the US economically than China. So we will abandon things that bring us closer to China, like the deal to stop RMP for oil in Saudi Arabia, and so on. We're going to follow 3 lines of argument. Rebuttal will be integrated. Firstly, that China is an unreliable partner, both economically and militarily. Secondly, that the US is reliable and provides more value add, especially with the technology sector, which they talk about a lot. And finally, even if it isn't, abandoning the US invites retaliation from them in a way that abandoning China does not. First argument, that China is an unreliable partner. I think we can agree that this is important because economic ties should not fluctuate. We need stable cash flows from trade, and MBS has staked its entire reputation on expensive projects that require stable flows of international investment, like NEOM and Vision 2030. China is unreliable for a number of reasons. Firstly, they are currently much less willing to spend money, both on economic development and arms trade. They are much less rich in the US on a per capita basis, and also its growth model has harmed its ability to spend sustainably, because local government debt, investing billions of dollars in things like railways reaching isolated cities, has grown tremendously, and most economic growth in China is driven by SOE. So local domestic debt has increased tremendously, demand is drying up, and things like the tech industry, which is under repeated attacks by the government, have suffered massive amounts of brain drain and a chilling effect that stops them from being effectively like domestic investors from wanting to invest in it in a sustainable way. Finally, we also think that demographic slowdown in China has stopped it from being able to invest overseas as much. Look at how all the Belt and Road Initiative projects in Africa have basically dried up, and China has left many of its partners in Africa basically hanging. Look at how China pulled out, for example, of many Southeast Asian countries where they pledged substantial investment. On the comparative, the US still has a more stable debt situation because its debt is dollar denominated, and moreover it has immigration to boost its demographics. We think that it's a better partner just in terms of the demand aspect. Secondly, Chinese ties to Iran make it an unreliable partner. China remains a key partner with Iran for the reason that China has maintained a long-term and stable diplomatic network with Ali Khamenei's government. China also has more leverage over Iran because Iran has like no further allies aside from China and Russia. So we think that China has a natural incentive to seek Iran out more. Iran is a substantial military industry which provides value to China. As a consequence, like China's domestic military spending is a fraction of that of the US, and therefore it has to rely more on allies like Iran to supply it with military projects and military tools, and also supply Chinese allies like Russia, for example. So China has a more natural incentive to rely on Iran than it does in Saudi Arabia. What is the consequence of this? It means that it forces Saudi Arabia to compromise on core issues of core political importance, which are central to MBS's claim to power. Things like, for example, encouraging him to pull out of Yemen, or for example, encouraging him to step down the amount of Wahhabi outreach missions we send overseas in order to appease Iranian interests. We think that China will be a much less reliable partner just because it has more interest of remaining aligned with Iran, and it has a longer-term relationship with them. Finally, we think that China just has less of a need for Saudi oil, right? Because firstly, China can rely on Russia for the domestic energy production, and also it can rely on things like reopening coal-fired power plants and reviving those that were rendered obsolete 10 years ago, because there are no annoying ESG investors in China that stop them from reopening all these coal-fired power plants. So for all these reasons, we think that there's less demand for oil from Saudi Arabia as compared to the US, and that this makes China a less reliable partner. What do we hear from OG? They say that China has a growing consumer base. We agree that this is true, but it also has larger domestic production, especially in lower-tier industries that compete with the things that Saudi Arabia are likely to manufacture, so this is likely to be a wash. Moreover, we think that accessing the Chinese market in particular cuts you off from the rest of the world, which is a much larger market. Why is that the case? Firstly, because China has been known to force nations to sign most favored nation trade status with them. They did this with all of the Belt and Road initiatives in Africa and with Myanmar, for example. In a moment. Moreover, China will soon be under more sanctions from the West, especially with things like the CFI US and the US. So we have less access to global markets for China and its trading partners. Closing.
Yeah, so the motion implies moving away somewhat from Iran. Look at the fact that there was last week an agreement signed that brokered peace, at least in a limited fashion, between Iran and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, exactly. That is an exact example of how China has encouraged Saudi Arabia to go against its own interests and seek out an alliance with Iran. I don't think it's like a core part of MBS's claim to power that we want to make peace with Iran. In fact, this weakens its claim to legitimacy, so that actually supports our argument. Finally, they say that China is authoritarian, so like Saudi Arabia can use its authoritarian technology to spy on its own citizens. Firstly, we don't think that it's likely that China will share this technology because it is a matter of national security. Moreover, if we talk about the quality of artificial intelligence, US companies actually have more researchers in this area because the government isn't trying to actively clamp down and disappear individuals who work in the technology sector. So we think that this is just at best a wash. Okay, so why is the US a more reliable ally? We think that, sure, the US may engage in posturing for political reasons, but there is no tangible impact of this on policy. Firstly, because the US needs scalable power and reliable partners in the Middle East, because historically there is a huge political anti-Iran sentiment in the US, and Iran has purified nuclear power to 84% and restricts any kind of IAEA inspections. So we think that they have an interest in supporting Saudi Arabia against Iran. Also, the US energy crisis is intensifying given their attempts to impose price caps of Russian gas and the ineffectiveness of shale gas and offshore drilling to supply US domestic needs. The path for renewables has come under significant assault from anti-ESG Republicans, and therefore the US needs to import more oil. Relations with other oil partners like Venezuela have been souring, and of course Russia is totally off the table. I'll take any POI from opening.
Yeah, so yes, China does do favored trade agreements with many small countries in Central Asia, but we're talking about Saudi Arabia here, and clearly we've already explained they've got leverage to protect themselves.
Sure, but once they move away from the US, they start to rapidly lose more of that leverage. Also, if China is as important to Saudi Arabian national interests as the EU claim, then Saudi Arabia will become more and more dependent on China as it uses up more, for example, more and more Chinese technology. So this actually happens, Saudi Arabia becomes more and more dependent the more you leave the West and focus on China. So we think that it's important also to get US technology, as I mentioned, and US expertise, because China doesn't have like a semiconductor industry and they are clamping down massively on the tech sector. Also know that the US doesn't want to nuclearize Saudi Arabia, so they're likely to have an interest to continue remaining in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia can easily get fissile material from like Russia or China, so this is a valid concern for the US to remain invested. Final argument, that this invites US retaliation. Note that the key difference between China and the US is that China traditionally has not engaged in foreign intervention of a military type outside of its sphere of influence. Because firstly, it just needs to focus more on consolidating its control over Xinjiang and Taiwan, and there's more international spotlight against any kind of Chinese aggression or Chinese attempts to expand in the Middle East. The US has no such reservations. It's more likely to use subversive means to stop Saudi Arabia from being able to engage in closer trade relations with China, and it's more likely to militarily intervene in its surrounding countries, or for example, oppose Saudi interests in Yemen and Syria, because there's like no such international pressure against the US intervening in the Middle East. We're proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to further the case of opening government, I call upon the Deputy Prime Minister here.
I want to give some good reasons why necessarily there might be a capacity for the US to be a better ally. But they don't really do much introspection over the interests of the US and interests of China, which is on key where our analysis lies. Because yes, maybe it is the case that the US has a currently bigger economy and has more ability to be a global hegemon, but the US has never implemented something as big as the BRI, because the US has things like a democratic mandate, which means that its population, even if they have the dollars to do so, do not want its president and its cabinet to be throwing money into countries where they won't see a short-term return. But China does have the interest to do that, because China is great and authoritarian, and something where they do have that fundamental interest to invest there is why, for example, even if the US is big tech and big interest and all that kind of stuff, at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia is a country that is very, very far away from the US, and the US sole focus in Saudi Arabia is maybe to get some of its oil, but that is offset and weighed out by other interests, like its democratic mandate to not support a regime that is fundamentally immoral. But China has a myriad of interests that completely align with investing in Saudi Arabia. Not just the oil, but the fact that they want to implement the BRI, the fact that they care about regional stability and regional development, the fact that they care about global legitimacy, because organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the AIIB want to expand and want to get member states within the Middle East to buy in. That is the reason why we win this debate, because we prove the interest rather than just the capacity. Let's firstly talk about economics, and let's talk about regional stability. Firstly, in terms of economics, the big push from opening opposition is the contextual idea that China currently is facing some kind of debt crisis, which means that it is currently scaling down some of its projects, which means it currently has a low capacity to do a lot of these things. The first thing to say is that it is unclear if this fact is very, very true. China, to a large degree, is already recovering from the economic setbacks of COVID, and importantly, where it cops losses, the government is willing to entail those losses, unlike the US, because it does not have a democratic mandate. So their willingness to cop losses is higher than the US. But more importantly, secondly, where they have empirically scaled down is not in countries like Saudi Arabia, but is in countries like Central Asia and in Africa. And the reason why they have done this is because people within Central Asia and Africa are much poorer, which means the time horizon for the investment to get a return, which say the time for which people in Africa to become middle class consumers so that they can buy Chinese products and make China rich, is in decades, right? Versus a country like Saudi Arabia, where the people are already middle class or approaching middle class, which means in the short time horizon, you're likely to already unlock that economic capacity. But the second reason why China has pulled out of countries like Africa not countries like Africa, continents like Africa and areas like Central Asia, is because those countries has far less to offer China in terms of leverage, right? But we explain that Saudi Arabia uniquely will have a lot of leverage over China because they offer a lot of crude oil, which is a resource that China really desperately needs. So yes, their analysis applies to the exact examples they were talking about, which is little countries in Africa and Central Asia, but do not apply uniquely to Saudi Arabia, where there's a very big short-run horizon to unlock the consumer base there. But the other really important thing to consider, is like their analysis is like, well, there's a lot of loss there. But remember, this is not just like China just throwing infrastructure free. This is a profitable trade relationship where China is also profiting because it's also able to get a lot of oil out of that region. And that oil is crucial to Chinese economy, crucial to Chinese recovery, and crucial to them getting out of this debt crisis in the first place. But even if you believe that factual assertion that China's just gonna pull out because, you know, they're saddled in all this debt, this is an extremely short-term consideration. Like, you have to believe that China will abandon the BRI long into the future for this claim to actually have weight. We look into the future and know in 10 years, in 20 years, when you talk about a regional relationship, this isn't like, this distancing from the US isn't going to happen like within a year. It's going to happen over years and years of brokerage. And in that long-term horizon, if you believe China's going to recover the BRI, then you should weigh our claims more than theirs, because their claim is like literally this year, like China, like the stocks are down, you know, like, and that's like the extent of the analysis. But lastly, even if you believe all of that, China has already started BRI implementation in a lot of these regions. They've already built bridges, they've already built ports, and the problem is they've already sunk the cost there, but they haven't been able to activate the profit. The second stage of activating the profit is the kinds of thing that this closer tie will run. And we impact this in the context of things like smart cities, because Saudi Arabia doesn't want to be an oil exporting country into the long run. They want to become a service economy. They want to deliver to the world and not just to the US and the China. And that's why they've spent billions of dollars, maybe millions of dollars into these smart cities, and China's a crucial architect to that expansion, and currently is, because China has the willingness and the capacity to invest in these smart cities. Yes, you prove the US has some technologies, but no US companies are currently within smart cities because people boycott them, because people think Saudi Arabia is fundamentally a corrupt and bad regime. I'll take your point.
Sure, do you think the democratic US or authoritarian China is better able to bite the bullet and pass higher oil prices to its own citizens?
Oh, obviously when you're authoritarian, you can bite the bullet, right? Like, I guess you're saying like China will prefer to opt out of a deal with Saudi Arabia. No, the mechanism works the other way around, because China wants a long-term deal with Saudi Arabia, which destroys your material about how they've short-run debt. So that mechanism is actually for our side. So, secondly, in terms of regional stability. So, we explained that China has a unique advantage in situating itself as a deal maker because there's incentives that are regional versus the US that only has incentives with one country. What are their responses? Firstly, they say China is allied with Iran. This is actually a benefit. Actually, closing, I'll take you.
Yeah. Insofar as China is affiliated with Iran, don't you think that a lot of their incentives remain constant?
I'll deal with this. Firstly, you can't make Iran go away under your side as long as Iran exists under there. Obviously, Saudi is sinking like hundreds of thousands of dollars into funding regional insurgents to fight the wars there. They're still incurring that instability. You can't just make Iran go away. The only way that you can make the situation beneficial is if you broker some kind of peace deal. Yes, this might have some short-term repercussions on Saudi Arabia, but that is far better when they have confidence in a partner that they know will actually enforce that deal. And we explained in our analysis that China is in a good place to situate that deal. Like, I'm just so unsure of what their alternative is. Iran's still going to be funding regional insurgents. There's still going to be conflict there. Whether side that actually proves, like, yes, maybe this comes at some short-run diplomatic cost to Saudi Arabia, but China can broker that deal. And lastly, in terms of US retaliation, firstly, like, this is like one line of analysis. They don't prove this is the tipping point for the US to start, like, funding troops into the region. Secondly, the US does not have this incentive. Firstly, because it's costly. Secondly, because like it is offset by other governmental interests. And lastly, because like at the end of the day, yes, like maybe you lose US and US funds people there, but we also have China on our side as well. And China, for all the reasons that we explained, because they have a closer connection, they're far more likely to be sympathetic to those kind of regional problems that will largely offset any small retaliation that comes from the US. For these reasons, very proud to propose.
Thank you you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate in the opening half, I call upon the Deputy Leader of the OP. Here, here.
Everyone okay? Two things in my speech. First, Saudi's economic interests, and second, its national security. First, on its economic interests. The first and primary economic interest of the Saudi regime is, as opening government themselves identify, the need for Saudi to deliver to the world. Vision 2030, that's MBS's agenda to ensure that Saudi is able to meaningfully industrialize and in particular export high-tech products to the rest of the world, allowing it to diversify away from oil. To Saudi, this issue is existential. First, as more and more countries adopt clean technology and oil resources become more and more expensive as they become scarcer, Saudi's diversification is a prerequisite for the government and the people to get and accrue revenue from it. The second is it's also critical to their legitimacy. When MBS took over de facto power as the heir apparent to King Salman, MBS's legitimacy was founded on the idea that it's time for Saudi Arabia to engage in economic progress in a way that gives a broad diversity of jobs to people within Saudi Arabia. Who makes Vision 2030 happen faster? Their first claim is the US has no investment interest in Saudi Arabia, and they offer us two mechanisms for this. First, they say the US is excessively concerned with the human rights abuses that occur in Saudi Arabia and therefore place sanctions. This is absurdly ahistorical. In the aftermath of the killing of Jamal Khashoggi, the US literally did nothing. It gave them a slap on the wrist, and even after FBI and CIA investigations confirmed that Saudi indeed was responsible for the killing, President Trump claimed that it was not. Biden claimed on the campaign trail that Saudi was going to become a global pariah, but the US continues to finance Saudi's military campaign in Yemen against the Houthis, and Joe Biden literally keeps meeting MBS because he knows that they need Saudi's alliance, like the famous fist bump picture that he got a lot of flack for in the media, because the existential concern of the US population is not foreign policy, it's what their energy prices are and whether their businesses are getting meaningful investments. That's the existential concern that the government cares about. Their second mechanism is the US doesn't want to send its money elsewhere, China is willing to send its money elsewhere. But they themselves identify these are often lucrative deals. You're building high-tech infrastructure, which means your companies get profits and create jobs. That's the reason why there are a bunch of American companies with massive numbers of expats living in cities like Riyadh in Saudi Arabia and gaining and accruing revenue, no thank you, directly from these projects. Given this, the US clearly has investment interests in Saudi Arabia. But I want to be clear, these investment interests are substantially better than China's. And I want you to look at opening government's language. They say China's goal is, quote, to unlock the Saudi consumer base. You know what the majority of Belt and Road Initiative investments have been based around? They've been based around creating infrastructure for China to sell its products to the consumer bases of those countries. But Saudi doesn't want that. Saudi wants to build its export base and ensure its companies are profitably able to sell goods abroad rather than engage in the resource goods trade that they claim that undermines the very focus of Vision 2030 for Saudi Arabia. So all this does, no thank you, is creates fear that China creates infrastructure to dump its extraordinarily cheap goods because wages are lower in China than in Saudi Arabia to outcompete Saudi companies rather than enabling Vision 2030 to happen. And this is assuming they have the money. It is genuinely ludicrous for them to claim that all the debt crises that affect China are GDP numbers in the short term rather than systemic problems that affect China well over the long term. And there are three structural reasons for this. First, Population demographics. Arthur explains that Chinese population is aging. The implementation of the two-child policy, even after its repeal in 2015, had a one-child policy, even after its repeal in 2015, had a massive long-term effects that prevented Chinese families from having kids, creating an aging population and creating a debt problem. Second, the fact that SOEs, Chinese SOEs are absolutely loaded in debt because SOEs in China offer the iron rice bowl, where they effectively guarantee employment to anyone and can't engage in meaningful corporate restructuring or layoffs. That prevents them from meaningfully ensuring that SOEs have the money to sustain the kinds of investments that they want China to make in Saudi Arabia. The third is that local governments accumulated debt through fiscal reform, and critically, they have leverage over Xi because things like the Communist Party Congress depend on local CCP official government officials to ensure they are willing to deal with Xi being willing to do things like abolish term limits. All of these are strong and long-term incentives that constrain China's ability to engage in the free spending infrastructure projects that they have in countries where, by the way, infrastructure was far, far cheaper to build, like sub-Saharan Africa. Therefore, we get more infrastructure spending. The second concern is selling oil. Here, I think the problem with opening government is their failure to identify mutual exclusivity. China, no thank you, if it genuinely depends on oil so much, can continue getting oil from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia can continue getting massive amounts of Chinese cash by selling oil to them, and that's not mutually exclusive with ties to the US. However, in many cases, selling oil to the US is mutually exclusive to maintaining strong ties with China for precisely the reasons they identify. The fact that the US can reluctantly tap into its own oil reserves or authorize things like offshore drilling, the fact that the US can reluctantly build stronger relations with countries like Venezuela. It would prefer not to, but it has the capacity to, meaning Saudi needs to make an active effort to ensure the US wants to keep buying oil from it, that ensures that revenues go into Saudi Arabia right now, enabling it to finance the infrastructure investments that it needs to domestically create, like the smart cities that they are so concerned about. No, thank you. As a consequence, it is likely that Saudi's consumer base benefits substantially both from US investments and from engaging in exports to the US that doesn't happen with China. Closing.
Yeah, so China still exists. It can still compete with Saudi Arabia in the market and flood with goods with its cheaper workers. So why does any of that mitigation matter?
Because Saudi Arabia can slap tariffs on China if it doesn't enter a trade deal with them but enters a trade deal with the US. Not sure where the UI is going. No. Second thing, on the US being on military and geopolitics. They say that it's good to maintain good relations with Iran and China is heading in that direction. Look, let's not make more of this deal than what it actually was. All this did is return relations to the 2015 status quo where Iran and Saudi Arabia continue to have embassies in their respective countries. There are structural factors that mean tensions between these countries will continue. First, the fact that Saudi funds Wahhabist madrasas across the region, meaning Iran actively hates them. Second, the history of an ingrained religious conflict between Sunni and Shia. Third, the fact that they've had actively hostile relations for a substantial period of time, meaning there's inherent mistrust between the administrations of these regimes. China can't just make them hold hands, sing kumbaya, and assume everything is going to be all right into the long term. What's more likely to happen is China pressures Saudi Arabia in ways that the Saudi government perceives as endangering its security interests. So it's China that's going to pressure them to pull out of Yemen way quicker than they have to because Iran is funding Houthis, and China knows Iran is a more reliable actor precisely because Iran has less leverage over them than Saudi Arabia does. All of this undermines Saudi's interests because MBS perceives this as existential. The Saudi government thinks that Iran funding militias and terrorists on their border genuinely affects their threats. But the biggest existential issue for Saudi Arabia is whether they're able to diversify their economy. They are far more able to do that with the US as an ally proposed.
Thank you very much for that speech. We remind all speakers that in round robin you should be taking 2 POIs. And we open the debate in the closing half with the member of government. Hear, hear.
Right now, Saudi Arabia is in a conflict with Yemen in which, from the perspective of Saudi Arabia, Yemen is trying to bomb their own cities and create an existential military threat that literally threatens the lives of their civilians. And what exactly does this perfect ally of the United States say to this? They refuse recently to refuel any of their aircrafts that are going to Yemen. They refuse to sell them any munitions whatsoever. Well, simultaneously, the rest of Western nations all are sanctioning Saudi Arabia's ability to fight this war that they see as existentially important to the safety of their people. And Russia no longer has the capacity to sell them anything, leaving them literally like high and dry in one of the most important conflicts that they're involved in. At the same time, the United States is seeing an active pivot away from the Middle East due to perceived like weakening of Iran due to like instability within the country that makes it less necessary for the United States to be equally engaged as they previously were, paired with a dramatic amount of cynicism amongst the American public about American intervention in the Middle East due to years of perceived failure that make America's like incentives to engage continuously dramatically reduced. I also think that the U.S. has failed dramatically to broker deals in the region. So it is untrue that the U.S. is unwilling to broker deals with like Saudi Arabia or make like good faith efforts to do that. See, for example, the Abraham Accords, in which they almost like got them to sign like normalization of agreement with Israel and succeeded for Morocco and Qatar. The difference is that Saudi Arabia failed to sign on to those due to like essentially like political differences between like the United States and themselves that are intractable, right? Indicating that although the U.S. will try to do it in a comparable manner to China, it's doomed to fail due to these political differences. I also think that the purpose of their alliance, which is oil, becoming much more relevant due to the fact that you like both have substantially stronger alliance with other countries within Gulf states that are massive oil producers, see like UAE, Qatar, etc. See the fact that those countries signed the Abraham Accords, indicating greater political alliance with the United States that makes them more reliable. Plus, every year, the amount of like oil production within like Texas, for example, increasing makes this less likely. In contrast, what is our current relationship with China? China's already brokered a deal with Iran. OG mentioned this, but I think fails to explain the impacts in a comparative way and why this is better for China. It is true that, for example, like you don't want China to be biased in favor of Iran. But the thing is, China doesn't really uniformly support Iran in everything. They signed on to like sanctions against Iran in the context of the nuclear deal with Iran, precisely because they see Iran as an unstable regime that potentially is a threat to them to the extent that it does something like get nuclear power, and to the extent, sorry, nuclear weapons, and to the, no thank you, not this time, and to the extent that they can gain similar benefits of having that relationship by allying with like Saudi Arabia to gain like a foothold within geopolitics within the region, they're comparatively less likely to engage with like Iran to the same extent. To the extent that they're aiding Iran, they're less likely to do that when it would hinder their like trade agreements with another ally. But just if you don't believe any of this, you should just believe the Saudis themselves, which is to say they voluntarily agreed to an agreement brokered by China with them in Iran, indicating that they like have given their seal of approval to the style of diplomacy that China is already using between them and Iran, right? I think that I think for that, it's better. I think the reason why this is not, as OO says, somehow an existential crisis to them is because being able to reduce their military spending and normalize conditions where you could have like travel to these countries without being like banned is probably something that they care about, in addition to getting the ability to have like trade with these countries that are more stable. But I'll take a point from back out. Yeah.
Recognize the incredibly high burden you've set yourself in this debate. China can never replace intelligence sharing and security guarantees that the US provide in the status quo. You're contingent on a peace deal with Iran materializing, which is incredibly far-fetched.
But they're not doing it, right? That's the problem. At which point the United States is literally refusing to sell them weapons because there's massive amounts of public backlash against their action. They're not going to be willing to provide them intelligence. It's also untrue that China, especially going into the future, will be unable to provide them with adequate intelligence given the relative strength of China's intelligence agencies, right? I just don't think this is comparatively true. In terms of the future relations that you're likely to see with China, one is just as an arms supplier, right? They are now the only source of weapons you can reasonably buy from any developed nation with the type of like, manufacturing capacity that they need in order to keep their like, troops armed. Note that this is incredibly crucial and something that they need precisely because it's existential in nature, right? The failure of the ability to supply your military when like, no one else is willing to sell to you means that you're substantially more likely to have your civilians killed in warfare, which is like something that currently the government cares about, probably more than any other issue due to the like, magnitude of it, which is why this weighs over anything in top down. Sure.
In the context of Yemen, Saudi knows the Hadi government isn't coming back and it knows it's likely to lose the war. What it's looking for is some short-term military financing to get a good deal with the Houthis. The US is providing that financing. It hasn't cut all that financing off, while China is way more averse to engaging in international
affairs. I have no idea the extent to which that's true, but the fact remains that the US is refusing to sell them munitions, which Max assures me is a fact, and at the same time, I don't know, I trust him, okay? He looks trustworthy. At the same time, right, like China has like the capacity to supply these munitions continuously, and I think even if you don't buy this for Yemen, as you go into the future with an increasing trend of like, Americans becoming more jaded towards Saudi Arabia and the West being more willing to pass sanctions, which they've like practically done, I think in future conflicts where this happens, you're comparatively more likely to get those weapons from China. No, this doesn't even require like money from China necessarily, right? It can be mutually beneficial in the sense that China is able to like make money off of selling these weapons, but crucially it requires like, negotiating with them in good faith, which I think the US might not want because it challenges their relationship. I think the fact that Saudi Arabia is more routinely sanctioned and continuously more unpopular also makes China's role in helping to break sanctions important, right? Note China's role in helping Sudan break sanctions because of helping their profit interest, which is not something that the U.S. is willing to do because it's comparatively more accountable to citizens that care about human rights violations. I think that this means that you get, even if, for example, the West has very strong economies that you can care about, two things are true. One, to the extent that the West decides to sanction them for human rights violations, which already happened, then you get none of those benefits because you can't trade with them, right? So just the fact that China becomes a more stable market is better. But the other reason why we think China is better as a market is because it's substantially larger. The U.S. is currently engaging in an unprecedented degree of protectionism, pulling it out of international relationships, and expressing political ideologies that would continue to do as much. I think in contrast, China is currently negotiating unprecedented amounts of free trade agreements between countries in its sphere of influence, which gives it access to very large markets and would include Saudi Arabia in this, but only if they're willing to break away from the United States. I think which means that you get massive access to markets. Note that even if it's the case that these markets are comparatively weaker, the sheer magnitude of the number of people there still means that you're able to sell to very wide groups of consumers, which still enables it to be dramatically more popular. I think all of this means that you get substantially better aid. I think the other reason they're continuing to do this in a way that's probably positive is the fact that they need to signal to other countries that they're trying to expand in Africa, for example, that they can be a good impartial negotiator and aid in the development of countries, because as countries are deciding whether or not to join China's sphere of influence, they need to weigh that based on the fact that they're observing their current behavior now, which is why you're likely to get good terms and good treatment, because this is China demonstrating to the world the nature of its actions. Finally, just brief reputation. Yes, SOE debt might be inefficient, but it's also tons of money that is currently still being printed and given away. I think the fact that this is true means that you are able to gain lots of money. The fact that this can be mutually beneficial means that you're still able to get agreements that are in China's interest and profitable for them, and therefore will happen. For all those reasons, try to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now we call the member up. Here.
Here.
The panel's ready. Tejas correctly intuits that opposition is not supporting the status quo, but fails to explain the full implications of that. The status quo is one in which Saudi Arabia has a degree of business ties with both actors and will likely continue into the future. Their side is one in which Saudi substantially increases ties with China, even at the expense of US backlash or as open and government-conceded sanctions. I'm first going to deal with both government teams, explain the implications of this framing, and then do security stuff. First, on CG. The first observation I'd like to make about their case is they need to live in the comparative. It's true that the US might not unreservedly be bombing the Houthis as they were in 2016, or providing indiscriminate air support, which is the article Jacob read to formulate the extension. This does not mean that they still do not fund the Saudi war machine, support counterterrorism efforts through intel sharing to a massive extent, coordinate the joint weapons sales and exchange of information to a great extent, and coordinate Saudi and Israeli Africans to the Houthis to a massive extent, because they see this as Iran as a very strong threat, and they see it as very existentially important to secure the region. The comparative is that China is never able to replace those security guarantees. Note that their extension is contingent on essentially the brokerage of a peace deal between these different actors. Note that even if China gets a full normalization agreement, and note the barrier of proof to this argument is not met even slightly, it's not likely to have enforcement teeth and will likely lead back to the cycle of violence. Why? Firstly, there is no enforceability mechanism that China can deploy. As Open and Government analyzes, China is unlikely to replace the US in areas like intelligence sharing technology and weapon systems development, which means it's unlikely to be the case that they're actually going to be able to cause these things. But secondly, Iran has very diametrically imposed regional interests that stay constant regardless of normalization with Saudi Arabia. That is to say, it needs to continue to expand its sphere of influence and avoid US sanctions that aren't going away regardless, and continue to agitate through actors like Lebanon, through Hamas, and through other individuals in order to accrue some degree of economic capital and secure dark money funding through things like Hezbollah and other actors that engage in kinds of trafficking, conflict diamond sales, and things like this. Insofar as Iran sees the US as an existential threat, these behaviors are going to continue, and the US will continue its behaviors to crack down on Iran symmetrically. Insofar as that's the case, Iran will continue to have an incentive to create regional instability in Iraq, which is a critical transit route for Saudi oil and resources, and to continue to create regional instabilities in areas of interest to Saudi Arabia. What this then means is it is unlikely to be the case that the peace deal A lasts particularly long, or B has any real degree of enforcement mechanisms, which is unlikely that the status quo conflicts they want to talk about will stop. Closing government is out. Why is opening government out? The first thing I want to observe here about their analysis straight out of the 2016 Economist issue is that firstly, I want to make it clear that we can concede that more trade with China can be good in some instances or sectors. In the same way it's intuitive that we're defending the status quo and we can defend more trade with the US in some sectors, it's probably the case we can defend the same as China as well. So even if this dated characterization about China is true, we can engage in economic ties with them insofar as they're not mutually exclusive to ties with the West. The second observation I want to make about their characterization is that it's silly. First, as Tejas observes, they're deeply in debt and scaling down international investment. But secondly, large-scale wariness to Chinese international investment because the history of debt-trap diplomacy and seizure of ports like in Gwadar and Pakistan has been extremely detrimental to them. But thirdly, China empirically is turning inwards because international investment does not generate a sufficient manufacturing base to account for disruption. So COVID, the supply crisis, the Russia-Ukraine war, and things like this, which is the ethos behind Xi's zero-COVID policy and his made-in-China programs. The final thing I want to point out here is that even if all of their reasons why China has sunk costs into tons of investment in Saudi Arabia are true, I have no idea why they'd ever pull out. Surely they'll take what they can get right, because the comparative, as opening government explicitly concedes, is not some money and more money, it is no money because you get sanctioned by the US on their side, versus some but maybe not as much money as OG could get if the US doesn't exist. That's Gov teams dealt with. I will now position our extension in the round and weigh it against opening opposition, who I think is the strongest threat in the round, and did a reasonably good job explicating the baseline mechanisms as to why this might be a bad idea. What is the problem with OO? Note that top half is in contingent on extreme characterizations of China and the US that are highly under-nuanced. The US is not a power in decline. China is not a pariah state. Plausibly, OG and OO make valid observations of circumstances in which investment from one or the other could be beneficial, and in many instances, those things are mutually inexclusive, like security tech, but other times, maybe like weapon systems, it's not. Why is it that Saudi Arabia, as a point of framing, is likely to be able to maintain ties with both powers in the status quo? And no, OG gave us no reason to believe that if we don't pivot to China, we still won't get trade. Before I explain that, I'll take opening.
Everyone focuses on short-term and example-reliant issues like Yemen or COVID.
Yeah.
Only we structurally explained alignment of China and Saudi's interests in the long run.
The premise of this extension is that regardless of what happens, China is likely to be able to continue to play both actors off one another ad infinitum. I'm going to explain that now, and at that point that deals with every claim you've made thus far in the debate. The first thing I want to note is that China is unlikely to stop investing in Saudi over the long term if it continues trade with the West. The reason this is true is because Chinese firms do need to recoup debt at a very large scale. So even if they pull back or scale back to some degree in the future, as O says, they're still going to invest to an extent. They also have an interest in facilitating trade in MENA, and a good security environment there is good for facilitating investment. And China finally is very rarely willing, just empirically, to cut ties with the state as a result of status quo ties, because pulling out firms gives up market share to geopolitical rivals, and China doesn't want to do that. But conversely, the US is also unlikely to pull away from Saudi Arabia as a result of its status quo China agreements, because the US isn't getting weaker, as OO says. Note that they're building up tons of new initiatives, like Made in America, the CHIPS Act, which led to the production of high-tech chips and semiconductors happening locally, but also massive military spending is likely to remain constant. They still sell massive amounts of arms to Saudi Arabia. That's going to happen on either side. They still spend more than China on this per capita and likely will far into the future. But thirdly, the US still has the world reserve currency as home to the largest NC. It's unlikely to decline to the degree that they're not just going to be supplying those kinds of things in the future. But finally, the democratic mechanism is self-correcting for bad policy. You can use that democratic mechanism to hold bad leaders accountable, which means the US is likely to be more stable in the long term. Whereas China is beholden to the whims of Xi Jinping and whatever his inner council says, and there's very little discourse within the highest echelons of the Politburo around Xi's decisions to the same extent. So it's likely the US stays and continues to invest to a massive extent. How has Saudi been able to exploit this? Before I do that, I'll engage with
I think this fails to engage with all of the reasons that both Gov teams gave about why it is unlikely that the United States is going to continue to have interest in Saudi Arabia given their increased domestic oil supply and decrease in military aid, increase in sanctions, all of this.
Insofar as Iran remains a critical threat and will continue to do so in the future, the US continues to have an investment interest in engaging with those things. I also gave a million other mechanisms at the top. I think that is clearly dealt with. Why is it the case that Saudi has been able to exploit this? Note that in the status quo, the threat of signing one deal versus another exists, meaning every negotiation and every opportunity to go to a rival induces more favorable deals at every stage. So you get kingmaker leverage over every deal. The problem is when you one and done cut ties, you alienate the US to a far greater degree and you can't do this anymore. But secondly, Saudi in the status quo is able to hold reserves in both dollars and yuan, which insulates it from economic shocks. Now when the value of yuan fluctuates, you still have dollar reserves, and when you have yuan, you can hedge against the outside risk of Jerome Powell's terrible monetary policy. But thirdly, it isolates Saudi Arabia from economic shocks that happen endogenously in both the US and China, because they have access to both funding streams. So if Tejas is right and in the status quo, China is unstable, then they can get US funding. If they're right, and it happens to be that US is unstable in the status quo, they can get Chinese funding. Insofar as they don't alienate either actor by committing to the bit to one too hard, they continue to engage in that kind of thing. What this means is that they have to defend closer ties to the degree it causes a tipping point of backlash. Why does significantly closer ties with China mean there is that degree of backlash? The trivial reason for this is the US is caught between two groups of lawmakers, populist internationalists and committed isolationists, on both left and right. When Saudi pivots away and engages in, buying weapon systems and things like this, like when Turkey bought the S-4000 weapon system from Russia that actually did lead to sanctions being imposed on them, it is far more likely you ally those different groups of people together. When that happens, it is far more likely that you get far worse development problems. Not only do you get all the harms that they talk about in opening opposition, you also get far harder to secure weapon systems and security, but you also insulate yourself from development problems to a massively greater extent. I ran out of time to weigh this explicitly against opening opposition, but it is clear from the constructive way it beats them, and Ahmed will do the explicit weighing and extension, and I've dealt with both gov teams. So incredibly proud to win from closing optics.
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate in the Gov side, I call upon the quick. Here.
Here. Everyone ready? I want to make something very clear. Other than oil, there is very little logical reason, short of Iran, which I'll get to in one moment, why the US should care about Saudi Arabia. Their major ally in the Middle East, which oddly no one has mentioned at all in the debate despite their pivotal importance, is Israel. This will always be the case. They will always have the ability to get intelligence on Iran via them, to launch military strikes at Iran via them. It is not clear why Saudi Arabia matters on this. On oil, both opening op and opening government already agreed in the front half that long-run trends away from oil, even though oil hedges on the short term, matter. And I think that the larger takeaway from this is that the petrodollar system and other such reasons why the US was involved with Saudi Arabia has fallen apart. And in terms of what Saudi Arabia wants to do with its economy, it is not meaningfully compatible with trading with the US in the future short of oil. It wants to be an advanced service economy similar to the US with very little comparative advantage in terms of trade. I'm going to do three things on that then. The first, I'm going to talk about OO and their unstrategic mech dumping. Then I'm going to talk about closing off and how they want both worlds analysis. And then I'll explain why our extension, both on the economic long term, and most importantly on the military, wins. Before that, I just want to deal with the straw man, which is to say that our extension is not a one-liner about a peace deal. Our extension, as Jacob very clearly explained, is that there is one country in the world that will sustainably, over the next 20, 30 years, sell weapons that are critical for Saudi Arabia to have any leverage or defend itself to Saudi Arabia. Russia is devastated militarily. They practically have no weapons left for their own military, to the point where they're taking 1940s weapons out onto the battlefield. The legacy of sanctions over semiconductor access mean that they have essentially no access to being able to build any weapons. The US, you're right, on OO, is still sending a lot of money to Saudi Arabia, and it has some, basically path-dependent deals for arms. But the long-run political priorities in the US make zero sense for them to continue doing this, and all OP has done is to assert that this will happen because they cared about Iran. Guess what? They can send more money to Israel. They can directly send forces to fight Hezbollah and Hamas in the Middle East. It is not abundantly clear why you need to do this as a vehicle to combat Iran. In terms of intelligence sharing, China has massively expanded its own intelligence sharing networks and has signed deals with countries like India on this stuff, so it's not clear why this would be an exclusive benefit. The takeaway from this argument is thus as follows. The US, while there might in circumstances happen, the stars cross right on Iran on a given day, send more weapons to Saudi Arabia. It will never be enough because they don't want Saudi Arabia to have leverage and be powerful. And moreover, it is clear right now that under the Biden administration, which, say what you want about the likelihood of getting reelected, the long-run priorities are not towards the Middle East, they're towards China. That's why the pivot to Asia is a dominant American strategy. So it's not clear they're going to keep sending advanced weapons to Saudi Arabia, which is critical because the countries that Saudi Arabia doesn't like, namely Israel and Iran, have very, very advanced weapons. So if you're getting only bad weapons, it doesn't seemingly matter. China is the only country that will sell weapons. And the reason that is important is that CO's framing is directly beaten by this. They say you can play both countries off each other for trade. And we agree to an extent. You can, of course, trade with both of these countries. But whether or not a country sells you weapons is not a simple matter of economic trade. It is a matter of trust and negotiations. And our point was that only via the stuff that's happening right now, like probably the reason why Saudi Arabia would ever agree to a deal that all of the OO claims just say is due to structural reasons, never something that they would accept, is probably because China, I would guess, probably made some promises to Saudi Arabia in terms of security as a vehicle to make them make a deal with a country that logically, according to their case, Iran, they should never make peace with. I'll note that OO's only reason why we shouldn't make peace with Iran was that this would be bad for MBS. I have no idea why we only weighed a debate from what is literally only good for MBS. It is good for Saudi Arabia, which has cities getting bombed by Hezbollah, to make peace with Iran. So I think insofar as OO literally says in their case that China pressured pressured Saudi Arabia to make a deal with Iran, that is a claim for our side. Closing.
Yeah, China will never sell weapons to Saudi Arabia. Not only is this a massive provocation to the US that likely gets more of their weapons contractors blacklisted and subject to US sanctions, they're also not going to do it because it undercuts their entire rationale of their negotiations with Iran that Jacob talked about. On second thought, the peace negotiation thing was better.
I have no idea what that secondary part went. You can explain it in WIP. In terms of escalating with the US, China is doing arms sales with all kinds of countries around the world that the US has not presently sold arms to. I have no idea why there's a tipping point. Moreover, they are lucrative, and those companies being blacklisted by the US already, or at least a lot of them, are a reason why they have few people they can sell their weapons to, so presumably it will happen. Moreover, insofar as the motion is about developing closer ties, it presumably involves making those relationships. So to refute the motion by saying, well, this could never happen, kind of goes against the logic of the motion. The secondary question is on the new stuff out of OO in terms of economics. I'll take you later. Now, there are a lot of really random observations, many of which are actually just not true. Like, I don't think they know what an MFN deal is, because you can't have an exploitative MFN deal. The MFN rules are actually rules why you can't favor countries in trade. But if you actually look past all of these things, the end point is that China has economic headwinds right now, and the market's not great. We agree, CO actually outframes them on this when they say that you have an ability to trade with both countries anyway. Our suggestion is that this is just not true in the majority of cases. A, the sanctions on Khashoggi, which OG mentions and no one responds to for some reason. But second of all, the fact that there are just very few things that Saudi Arabia could trade with the majority of the West in terms of where their economy wants to go. They want to build an advanced service and manufacturing economy. OO says, now China is your competitor, because you want to have a similar economy to China. And I think that makes sense, but as I point out in the POI, China still exists and will still flood the market with these things. Their response is, Saudi Arabia could sanction China? I mean, A, why would they do this? Their consumers love buying stuff from China because it's practically rich Americans living in Aramco. But more importantly, why would they do a massive escalation? That would imply that you can't play both sides off of each other in any way that's usefully meaningful to offside. So what is the takeaway then, before that opening?
Look, Saudi is the Middle East's largest economy, shares a massive border with Iran. The US doesn't want Israel surrounded by hostile countries. Its MNCs get returns on investment from investing in Saudi Arabia. We give you like 12 arguments for the US having incentives to engage, none of which you responded to.
So the point is more generally that if you ally with China, the US still has all those symmetric incentives to want to combat Iran in the Middle East, sure. But there is a real realignment that's happening. Look, there was a reason that China signed on to the Iran nuclear deal. They did not want them to get nuclear weapons either. They pressured overtly Iran into signing that deal. So of course, you would move away from the US. That doesn't mean that the US, in response to this, given how afraid it is of Iran, is going to react by totally burning bridges in the way that's being said. The way it probably reacts to a push closer to China is instead to continue everything else it's doing in the Middle East to combat Iran, while simply doing it less with Saudi Arabia. But that is potentially a reason why, given all the other reasons in the Middle East, that conflict with Iran is symmetric. What ends up being relevant is whether or not there are weapons to defend yourself and have leverage in those negotiations, which we prove are more likely to happen. What is the takeaway from our extension? We provided 3 relevant pieces of context. Number 1, why in the long run, economy is probably a watch. We pointed out why you could do trade with China via its integrated trade deals. They see BRI as closing. True, BRI is closing, but regional trade deals are not. You can still have those with China and send your advanced service and manufacturing economies all around the world to Africa. What is relevant is who is going to give you intelligence and military support in a reliable way. We said although it's possible that the US does this now, it won't continue. Only China will continue this. Very proud of our post. Woo!
Thank you very much for that speech. Now to close the debate, I call up on the upwick. Here.
Everybody ready? Three, 2, 1. The thesis of our extension is very simple. It's better to have 2 friends with benefits than 1 mediocre relationship, whether it's the US or China. The first thing I'm going to do is explicitly outweigh an opening opposition. Notice their case is the US is better than China for a variety of reasons. Tech alignment, investment, etc., and a substantial mitigation of the US as a consistent partner. Here's why Matt outwit extension on playing both sides, and the capacity and likelihood to be able to do this in the future outweighs their case. 1, Saudi Arabia's interests have hundreds of variables necessary to achieving their economic and security vision, some of which is uniquely able to be achieved by China, like the facial security tech, etc., all of that stuff. This means that it's more advantageous to leverage both than only relying on China. Secondarily, Omo is correct that it is not zero-sum right now, but they don't explain why it won't be zero-sum into the future. Matt is able to engage with OG's characterization better, for if the US declines into the future and it's a declining power, even in that case you can pick and choose and leverage them substantially better. Thirdly, and this is critical, this applies to substantially more scenarios that are uncertain in the international arena into the future. OG has plausible reasons that you can get market diversification through China. Matt jumps over this top half fashion over OO by explaining how you can pick and choose on an ad hoc basis as to what would be more advantageous to you in the dynamic and uncertain process of diversification through a number of dozens of different industries that you have to diversify. This then outweighs all of their lovely diversification mechanisms because they can't apply at every single point in time and every single industry that China has at least some comparative advantages in. So in other words, Matt is able to get you all of what OG and OO want by explaining why you can have 2 chairs in the international arena and a seat at the table. Let's take out CG. Firstly, that direct responses to their case proper. Why will the US still sell weapons to Saudi Arabia? Firstly, profit via weapons companies that are removed from public regulation and captured by the state. Insofar as both parties are directly funded by them and can't stop them and want to appease them for elections, it's unclear why they would still want to send these weapons insofar as these companies have profit incentives that are unrelated to the human rights issues they talk about. Secondarily, the threat of Iran, which even if it is mitigated, it is unquantifiable in theory and scale. The threat of a nuclear war that all politicians harp on. Thirdly, wanting to induce normalization with Israel, which note must be long-term and consistent in time. So you need to continuously sell to Saudi Arabia to make sure that that process is continuing. Why will China not sell these weapons and fill in the gap? One, massive provocation to the US that China doesn't want, insofar as more of their Chinese weapons might be blacklisted and sanctioned to other profitable areas in which they can sell. But secondarily, this is critical, this would piss Iran off and lose China's credibility as the neutral arbiter that they say is so important and has allowed them to enter that space to begin with. Because China's position is, I will negotiate some sort of deal between the two or bring you to the table because I'm not biased like the US where I'm only selling to one actor. Now they fill in those shoes and be the actor that they said that they were replacing going into the future. Now, let me get into the Gov case proper. The flaw in CG and OG is one that is at a premise level. They focus on undermining the benefits that the US otherwise provide. In other words, it's very defensive. They say, we don't really need the US because of all of these bad reasons, they're not really reliable, etc. They never explain why, in order to get the benefits that China provides, you need closer ties. This was the critical part of their case that they needed to develop more time on. Why is the sufficient conditions and the sufficient ties that they have not allowing them to get the actual benefits that they say are necessary? Now, let me get into OG now, and this will fill in more with CG. They must prove why developing closer ties necessitates these benefits and China won't still want to mutually provide all of these benefits regardless. Because note, OG and CG have given us this analysis. There's a benefit to China to do it regardless of whether you have closer ties or not. So there's no actual harm or trade-off that they've had to prove within their case. Here's why they still continue to provide all of the benefits that they talk about. I'm going to use OG's own analysis to explain to you the analysis that they've given us to prove this, but I'll give them a chance first.
So China needs big confidence to make big investments. Why would you, for example, build a big road if half the people driving on that road are just US investors?
Because you've said that they benefit from building that road. Because they have a BRI that they really need to go into Saudi Arabia regardless of how many people are driving on this road. And this is where I get into the analysis now. One, China wants the oil, so they'll still buy from Saudi Arabia even if they don't pivot harder because they need the oil like they say. Secondarily, China wants the BRI, so they need to go through the region of Saudi Arabia regardless of how much they position or make themselves fidel to, or increase their fidelity to China. Thirdly, they care about global expansion and legitimacy and need Muslim states to align, so you can't do this without Saudi Arabia. Or fourthly, they've sunk so much cost already, it would be foolish to pull out and make them look really bad and they lose their investments. In other words, they've given us the analysis to show that there is no actual harm from not developing these closer ties. That is to say, it's the incentive of China to give Saudi Arabia what they want, not necessarily in the inverse. But secondarily, and this is where Matt's extension fills in the gap in terms of information asymmetry. China doesn't know whether or not Saudi Arabia will pivot harder into the future or not. So when they take these investments, it's a risk that they expect, but they're operating on information that they don't know. They don't know if Saudi Arabia will want to pivot in the future or not. So they have the bargain to continue to give them these closer ties and benefits that Matt tells you about, that allows you to leverage both benefits in this round. Let's see you, quick POI.
The link that all the off-bench relies on is the idea that the US has political incentives to want to participate in playing off the both sides. Insofar as we point out that no matter how much the weapon contractors matter, the US does not have any real reason in the long run to care about Saudi Arabia and the Middle East because of Israel, because of other avenues to conflict with Iran, then you don't get your two cases.
See my previous analysis for why they want to care about Iran insofar as the harm is unjustifiable. They need consistent normalization of Israeli relations. They can't just be one and done. But thirdly, note they also want to get cheap oil, and insofar as there's private incentives for them to develop their industries by mutual aligning with Saudi Arabia's diversification. There's a benefit to the US to be involved anyway. So you needed to prove that. Now, the rest of OG's case is China's supposedly comparatively better for a number of reasons. One, they're more reliable because of human rights concerns. Note OG already, or O explained why they don't really care about human rights concerns. But what Matt tells you is there's less transparency about China's future behavior. So in other words, we'd rather engage with the devil that we know than the devil that we don't. So even if the US is going to be, for example, comparatively less reliable, we know how unreliable they would be compared to how we don't know how unreliable China can otherwise be because they're substantially less transparent about their political movements and their strategic choices. Secondarily, they say unique tech like facial recognition. We've outweighed that by explaining why they can pick and choose between both factors for the tech that they want. Thirdly, they say a rising consumer base. Note that this proves our point because they are catching up to the US. So insofar as you want to sell more or you want to sell more oil, the US probably wants to buy more of that oil because their service sector economy has more need for oil and more need for energy to actually provide this. In an uncertain international arena where there's a hurricane and you don't know what will happen, you need two chairs to sit on.